is ready now. James and I affirm the resolution. Contention 1 is increasing investment. Lifting the embargo brings more business to Cuba. The World Library explains that the Helms-Burton Act essentially stipulates that foreign companies must either trade with the United States or Cuba, and those companies choose the United States because they have a much bigger economy. As a result, the Associated Press reports that thousands of companies are waiting in anticipation for U.S. policymakers to lift the embargo and allow investment. Ian Bremer of the Peterson Institute for Economics quantifies that investment in Cuba would increase by more than 30-fold if we lifted the embargo. Investment in Cuba is crucial for two reasons. The first is reducing costs. After removing Stanford University further, that Cuba imports most of its goods from foreign producers, but pays high transportation and transaction costs as a result. Due to the United States' geographic proximity to Cuba, the United States would be able to import massive amounts of goods into Cuba at reduced prices if the embargo was lifted. These cheap goods would compete with the Cuban government's state-owned businesses and drive prices down. Alan Armstrong of the JV Business Foundation explains that economic competition brought to monopolistic markets reduces prices and increases the purchasing power of the people. The second is increasing wages. The OECD points out the obvious. FDI increases wages. Increased investment increases the demand for jobs, employing more workers, and paying them more. Looking at several different countries, an influx of foreign direct investment increased wages by up to 20% and was always positive. Brookings 2012 finds that as FDI does of this magnitude, it may markedly increase the demand for labor and even place upward pressure on national wages. The impact is Cuban quality of life. Free trade will allow wealth to flow into Cuba. Daniel Reddick of the Council on Foreign Relations explains that Cuba has missed out on $1.1 trillion in capital that would have occurred if there was not the embargo. The National Review explains that Cubans make on average only $20 a month, not nearly enough to subsist upon. As a result, hunger and disease plague millions in Cuba today. Contention 2 is catalyzing change. Lifting the embargo brings change to Cuba for three reasons. The first is the scapegoat effect. Griswold of the Cato Institute finds that the embargo enhances Castro's reputation because he can blame all economic failures upon it. Lifting the embargo forces the Castro administration to take responsibility for their policy failures, creating incentives for reform. The second is through trade leverage. Adrian Grieco of the Ascension Foundation explains that as more American investment pours into the Cuban economy, the U.S. will have more leverage in the political future of Cuba. The impetus is the power of businesses. When foreign investment enters countries, foreign businesses push for more liberal economic reform, less regulation, less monopolization, and more protections for businesses. Cato explains that in China specifically, once the floodgates to private ownership were opened, they could no longer be controlled. By early 1982, it became a national policy. Chinese agriculture was decollectivized. Third is through market forces. The simple existence of free trade democratizes countries. Griswold of the Cato Institute explains that increased trade and economic integration encourages civil freedom by opening society to new technology, communications, and democratic ideals. The greater wealth that accompanies trade promotes democracy by creating an economically independent middle class. As citizens acquire assets and reap the benefits of the private sector, they start to demand more freedom in their social system. The impact is political and economic reform. Andrew Pickles of Trinity University explains that economic investment breaks up state-controlled economies, much like Vietnam, who also saw the end of an embargo and liberal economic policies followed. In Vietnam specifically, the forces of market economy were unstoppable. The World Bank quantified that since the lifting of the embargo, Vietnam's GDP per capita growth has been among the fastest growing in the world, averaging 6.4% per year. Ultimately, James Robinson explains in his book Why Nations Fail that free political and economic institutions are inherently tied. Free markets are the keepers to free elections and democracy.
ideology across the region. As Eugene Pons from Miami University writes, Castro insisted that Poland's not balance was being laid to achieve power and provide institutional means to promote anti-American vital lines. Contention 2, promoting positive change. Subway human rights abuses. Lifting the embargo would exacerbate human rights abuses in Cuba in two ways. First, eliminating virtue signaling. Robert Torricelli, the Council of Foreign Relations, explains that every time the United States stands in defense of the principle against a dictator, that message is going out around the world. And the message shines a spotlight on bad actors, which is incredibly important, as Jackie DeVere from the University of Northern Texas indicates that being thrust into the spotlight makes killings risky in three ways. First, it threatens leaders with immediate punishment for killing. Second, shaming threatens perpetrators with the same types of punishments. And finally, shaming threatens leaders by raising the risk of an order being disobeyed. Thus, leaders respond to naming and shaming by deciding not to kill. As a result, DeVere empirically quantifies that shaming drops the likelihood of killing from 14% to as low as 0.04%. Second, reducing the funding for abuses. Nicolette Castiglione, the Jesuit from 2016, explains that lifting the embargo will fuel Cuba's repression of civilians by funneling profits to the dictatorship. Richard Feinberg from the Brookings Institute elaborates that this happens because FBI pays hard currency to the employment agency, which in turn compensates workers in local currency at an effective tax of 24-1, which means that over 90% of wages disappear in the currency conversion and go to the government. Chance Straus from the University of Mississippi writes that regimes are weakened by sanctions and will not have the resources to increase political repression due to the destabilizing impact of sanctions in the first place. The impact is substantial because the Freedom House organization ranks Cuba as one of the worst human rights offenders in the world with an accurate freedom score of 15 out of 100, and the Human Rights Watch elaborates that Cuba engages in arbitrary arrests of human rights offenders, independent journalists, and others, while inciting beatings, public shaming, and termination of employment, as more than 7,900 reports of arbitrary detentions occurred from January through August of 2016, and dozens of political prisoners remain in Cuba. Luckily, the New York Times finds that in recent years, after pressure from the United States, officials have released political prisoners who have been held for years, travel restrictions were relaxed, enabling prominent dissidents to travel abroad, and there's more tolerance for criticism of leadership in Cuba. Subway B structural reform. Jamie Subspeaking of the New York Times explains that the embargo is a negotiated tool to encourage change in Cuba, and unilateral concessions will be pocketed by Cuba without providing meaningful changes. Peter Aiken from the Inter-American Dialogue writes that this leverage is more crucial now than ever, as Raul Castro was shut down in 2018, allowing a new president to take over, and his new president will not bear the Castro name, be a hero of the Cuban Revolution, or be widely known. Thus, he must earn authority and legitimacy needed to govern effectively, which is why Alan Lee from Harvard Business Review elaborates that the new government will need to draw greater portions of legitimacy by driving economic growth and improving the lives of Cubans, which potentially pushes it to adopt more positions of the United States, and specifically Christina Hope from Business Researcher writes that limited liberalization is already allowed self-employment to go up from 2.8% in 2009 to 8.6% in 2016, which is why Alan Diaz from Miami Herald concludes that this alone mandates the embargo stay in place as it's the only leverage the United States has left. Thus, the engagement.
So now you have Cheerios. So now
I would say that they're both like equally.
Why are they equally important? One was a much longer time.
I would say that like they both have influences on each other. I actually don't think like argue about.
Like short term is a much shorter impact, right? Longer impact bigger.
That's not necessarily true.
So how is it not?
Because just because something lasts a long time doesn't mean it is.
But if the same impact lasting for longer, there's nothing even better.
Like, how do you guarantee
Like, I want a bigger matching that lasts longer. If it's smaller, they'll take the last one and that's it.
I don't understand why you're talking about people who eat lunch.
What did he just say? What did he say?
He was like, because you know how he keeps talking about milkshakes and food? He's like, do you need lunch?
Okay, everybody ready? Everybody ready? Okay. Starting on the contention one on terrorism, recognize the only reason that Cuba is able to fund terrorists in the status quo is because of the people that it's dealing with. Venezuela and China and the Soviet Union would never stop Cuba from funding these bad regimes. Recognize when the United States is the country that controls economic leverage over Cuba, this sort of funding ceases to exist, which specifically means our one on economic leverage is absolutely crucial in the sense, but we are the ones favorable in Cuba is no longer happy. Moving on to the contention two on positive change. First, they say that we're going to be seeing more Cuban resolutions through the naming and shaming. They say that the reason is because we haven't punished Cuba enough. That warrant makes absolutely no sense. We've had the embargo for 60 years. The entirety of the world sees it as an archaic Cold War policy. We're really not going to be let down once we lift the embargo. Specifically, even in the UN, almost every single country voted against the United States continuing the embargo, which really shows the international community is very done with the embargo. And even more specifically, the only reason these human rights abuses and these terrorists, like I told you before, occur is because the United States is not a country with economic leverage over Cuba. Once we have more control over what goes on there. But then specifically on their subpoint beyond funding. They say that almost all money flowing in from trade is going to go to the Cuban government. But recognize, this is completely not unique. Bookings indicate that in the status quo, China is already moving into Cuba with $1.6 billion in trade and even more money in loans, which specifically means the whole war here about how Cuba is going to get funded and able to control human rescues is going to be non-unique. But the reason that Chinese funding is uniquely worse than the United States funding is really important. First is the leverage point from our case. But even more importantly, China deals with Cuba in terms of like these sort of loans, which only goes towards the government. But FDI, from our case, goes directly to the people, or at least much more than goes to the people in loans that are given directly to the government, which specifically means the benefits from FDI and U.S. trade are substantial. But even more specifically, on the idea of the government controlling the majority of the economy. These people's evidence from the bottom of our case specifically indicates that in the short term, yes, the government does control a lot of the economy. But in the long term, especially in China and Vietnam, it is beneficial not only for the political elites, but also for the government itself to have a more market-based economy because it has more economic benefits and forces the capitalism to ultimately spiral out of control. Which is why in China, at first, leaders of the Communist Party believed that they were going to have a sort of restricted system, but in the long term, we saw China become more and more capitalist and more wealth flow into China. Then, specifically, they say that Cuba suffers from a lot of human rights abuses. The underlying reason is because the Cuban people don't have a lot of wealth. We play with our case and Griswold specifically. So when you go down to the your table, your concern really isn't the government abusing its people. When you have your table, the next step is still showing political rights. That is your next concern once you're able to feed yourself. That's what we tell you. More wealth going into the hands of Cubans is absolutely crucial in the round. We tell you when they have more wealth, they allocate for their own rights. Then finally, they release impact not only release political prisoners, but as their own cards, since there was only 54 political prisoners that were released in Cuba, ultimately sort of leveraging policy like the embargo is not very good leverage. Then, on the subpoint C, on reform in the status quo. Recognize that we've had the embargo for 60 years, we only saw reform in the last few years, which means the embargo is not the cause of the recent reform. Rather, as he said himself, Raul is very liberal, and he wants more liberal economic and political policies for Cuba, which means the reform continues in either world, whether you affirm or whether you negate. But they say that the leverage from the embargo is absolutely crucial. We say once you lift the embargo, you gain a new sort of economic leverage, which is the power of business, which occurs in our world specifically. But then, they say that Miguel Diaz-Canel is going to be a better president. This is fundamentally flawed. Recognizing Miguel Diaz-Canel, according to CNN, is only there to be president until the next Castro can step into power, once the next successor is old enough or of age to be part of the government. But even more specifically, Miguel Diaz-Canel is essentially become a president that's going to be controlled by Raul, who is essentially going to become the bad name of Cuba, which ends up meaning you're not really seeing a fundamental change in Cuban policy. Then, this is where we're seeing limited liberalization in the status quo. Recognize it's always going to be limited.
The reform that is occurring right now is reformed by the hands of a dictator. But dictators never see their power fully. There's only one way to truly break the cycle of temporary reform to get rolled back to Cuba. And this is specifically with our case. We need the way now that when you have invested in groups like the middle class or businesses that actually want long-term change in Cuba, unlike capitalism who wants sustainable socialism, you can see real long-term reform that have actual benefits to Cuban people. Here's the over.
Starting off when we realized that the reason Cuba is so bad, fundamental root cause of all of these problems is that an unaccountable authoritarian dictatorship currently in power. Insofar as that's true, whichever team that solves for that by pushing political, economic, and structural reform is the team that you go for today. So we seem to be in agreement. With that, let's look at why they learned the The first convention talks about increasing investment, just a couple of problems. First and foremost, according to Christina Hope, a business researcher, limited liberalization has already allowed business to come in, but then they immediately pull back out because they feel there is a lack of reform. Insofar as that's true, unless they directly prove you how it's supposed to happen, you drop them on face. But second, you're like, you drop like the dual currency analysis, and how many you in a case, you're going to drop the term as an argument on them. Basically, according to Ardrey from Harvard Business Review, despite some of those sources 2013 not getting rid of the system, as of today, it still exists. Hope tells you the reason that happened is because the reform movement got solving human bureaucracy, there really isn't the motivation for them to get rid of it. Why? Because according to Feinberg, as of right now, 90% of income FDI ends up going to the government. What that means is that when they tell you that increased money is good, that money gets funneled into the Cuban regime, and only increases its on longevity. What that means is that you turn them on face because according to Helen Miller from Columbia University, structural, political, and economic reform is the prerequisite to any form of long-term economic growth, not the other way around. They have all value reversed here because if you just pour money into a broken system, the government basically just falls. Let's do the one. First, let's do the one. First, tell you that costs is going to go down. That's going to be really competitive. But realize that the biggest export the U.S. has, one of the biggest exports the U.S. has is agriculture, big agriculture. That's really problematic because you have to go right down costs to the point that Cuban farmers can no longer compete. And that's uniquely detrimental because Cuban farmers are all subsistence farmers who grow their own food and they only sell food on the side so they make money, but they get pushed out of business. Now Cubans start selling. The second one about the outrage from it all. Remember, 90% of the income after ends up going to the government. That's not a huge problem. But the real problem here, they reach to a bunch of vague analysis along with other developing countries without accounting for the uniqueness of Cuba that is the dual currency system and other structural problems that Cuba has. We want their second pitch about analyzing things, which is all the problem has. Let me give you a few words here. First up, the scapegoat effect. According to Juan Lopez at Johns Hopkins University, no one buys them anymore. Cubans aren't stupid, it's not North Korea. There's information inflow. They should learn about what's happening. No one actually buys them. But second, according to Ardrey Kell from Trent University, which they also cite, what he concludes is that if you actually get rid of the embargo now, that's seen as a victory for the national regime. They're supposed to keep doing what they're doing if they got the mighty United States down after the demands. Now, second, talking about trade leverage, but in this own point, they can see that we trade with China, and China is still very oppressive of its own people, right? We also trade with Saudi Arabia, Iran, trade with all kinds of bad actors. Trade leverage isn't really a thing that we can weigh this down. They tell you that China's making economic change. That's because Deng Xiaoping came into power, and he was just have more reform mindset in general. They don't prove to you that's happening in Cuba. You don't get any eliminating tax rates. Their third, how the market is only people. First, they tell you that increased trade here is specific freedoms. Look at China. That's not true. But you turn this argument on them because what you're doing right now is you're going to end up entrenching the Cuban cash flow regime. Right now, we are in a unique position of force change that we haven't been in the past 6 years for a few reasons. First, according to Lynette Lopez, a business insider, both Russia and Venezuela have pulled their funding of the cash flow regime, and the Brooklyn Institute concludes that China isn't going to make up that gap either. That's why last year, Cuba's GDP actually shrunk by 0.9%. Second, according to Juan Lopez, the American Society of Civil Engineers, because they're losing money and the elites are losing money, their own bottom line is getting hurt, which is why modern elites are gaining power, they're also pushing for change. All of this accumulates the three of the counter earlier, which says that this new leader with no legitimacy is about to come into power and inherit this entire mess, and unless he actually makes reforms, he's going to get out of power really quickly. This is why empirically we've seen this leverage work. Over the last few years, the New York Times tells you researchers and tolerated more dissent. Hope tells you that they allow more self-employment. According to the Pew Research Center, in 2012, only 25% of the economy was private, but according to the Washington Office of Latin America, as of 2016, it's 33%, right? So the real problem here is we confirm you short-circuit all of that because we funnel more money into the regime due to dual currency and other issues. Remember, recessions are what forcing the concession, and insofar as they get rid of the recession by funneling money into the regime, they short-circuit reform, and we're not losing. You're going to lose. has an embargo in place at 20
Are those reforms still here today? No, they're not. Private business peaked in the 1990s. That is true. It's part that you cite in your own negative case, I'm pretty sure.
This is fine. Like really fundamentally, that's not true. That's right. It's going to code. Self-employment has grown almost 4 times. It's going to roll up for the last 4 years.
Wait. The Cuban economy was only 5% private in 2004.
Okay?
So it went from 0 to 5% when we had a recession. No, I'm saying in the 1990s we had a recession, right? You're saying at the end yes, Cuba had a recession. At the end of the recession, Cuba only had 5% private.
Right, as opposed to 0.
That wasn't true.
Yeah, so when Brendan knows from every university,
They
they
keep
keep
$73,000. We can read you evidence. Help me show.
According to Brendan Nolan from every university, in 1998, when the Soviet Union pulled their funding, because Cuba was running short on cash, similar to where they are now, but when the United States embargo was putting pressure on them, they made reform such as decriminalizing private enterprises. Before there was 0, then there were 5. Then
That didn't matter, right? Let me tell you specifically. The peak of privatization occurred in the middle of the 1990s. What happened as a result was the worst. The underlying reason why the government had to make reform was economic pressure.
Yes.
The war simply disappeared when Venezuela became April and
That's
Cuba,
what
which meant the reforms also
That's why
disappeared.
we're in a unique situation right now. Because Venezuela's pulled out, Russia's cut out, China's put out. No one's
Not
like
else to pay on my level. There's always going to be another actor, right? There's always going to be somebody that Cuba can trade. In my rebuttal, I specified China, which is regularly able $1.6 billion in trade. And here's the war low.
Use me to look at the bigger picture. Because like any numbers sound big out of context. So according to economic research last year, Cuba's GDP, despite the infusion of capital, China still shrunk 49%. That's a 47%. Even though Canada is throwing a little bit of money in, on that, they're not offsetting the amount that Venezuela and
At the height of the Cold War, Cuba's biggest stakeholder ever was only giving them $4 billion in loans, and as that's where we see $1.6 billion and increasing China in finance.
Everybody's ready? Start off with their first response to FBI. They say that there are still reports that need to be made and that no FBI will come in, but thousands of businesses have said that we will go in with the embargo because they see an untapped market. They have done the weighing for you and said that we don't care about these things that happen in Cuba. We are still going to go in. And they say that there's a dual currency system, but realize this exists for the sole purpose to attract FBI so they can use TUC instead of the worthless peso. They literally wouldn't have FBI if that happened. But then second of all, on Millburn, they say that 90% of income of FBI goes to the government. They never give us a warrant or the mechanism to how this happens. In fact, the labor tax is only 5% next year. It was 20% this year. It's no longer 90%, so I don't really know where they get that number from. Then they say that it's funded to cash flow. But even if the Cuban government takes more of the money, this is only short term. In the long term, Pickle says it spirals out of control of capitalism and structural political reform happens first. The Yale Law professor says that economic reform happens first. And on big agriculture, we solve hunger because we show you that we're importing food for lower cost and everybody increases their wages. Then 3 reasons why our case will always be more important. First, a dictator will never give up his power. He doesn't reform himself out. Only the middle class and foreign businesses can create permanent change. That's what we impact. The second of all, there's a never-ending cycle of reform and rollback to the egg world. They never tell you any permanent change that has resulted from 60 years of an embargo. Then third of all, not unique their entire case, because if we lift the embargo, U.S. companies will begin trading with Cuba, but if we keep the embargo, someone else is going to be big on Cuba. Either it will be Venezuela where their oil prices rebound in a few years, or it will be China, or it will be Japan, or it will be somebody else. There's never been a period of time that is long where they haven't had some sort of bankrolling. But then China said that even though next year they're going to be stepping up their investment, right now it's $1.6 billion, last year was $300 million, and they give conditional loans like they do in the rest of Latin America. And even if it's not China, it's 100% probability to be someone else. And I argue that it would be best that the U.S. is the one that controls that economic leverage. This is our second warrant. First of all, FBI increases by 30 times. They call when U.S. businesses set up in Cuba, they bring about the benefits. We talk about competition and jobs. Businesses lobby for more economic reform and less regulation, which is better for the private businesses in Cuba, because then we access the Gridwell card, which says that when you have this opening economy, when you have more private businesses, you will have an increase in wages of up to 30 times, and you see that you have a 9 times less likely to suffer under a dictatorship. But anyway, the most important impact is to capitalism, because that means more people control more of the economy, which is more power.
So first, you're going to look to the negative offense and narrative that concessions are a result from recessions. Realize that what we tell you from Lopez is that right now, the decrease in GDP in Cuba has happened because of the result of lack of trading partners. My opponent tries to tell you that because of this increased trade with other nations, they're going to rebound. Realize that's why you need to utilize the trade right now, because you need to weaken Cuba to the point where they have to increase even more privatization. This is really important because we show you 3 warrants to why these are actually true. First, we show you with the decrease in GDP that the elites push for more reform in the country so that they can gain back their wealth. Second, we show you that the new leader implements this reform because he takes mostly pressure from the elites in the regime change. But then lastly, we show you empirically that we've seen an increase in privatization from 25 to 30% in the last year, but we've also seen the release of political prisoners and the increase of dissent in the country that has been allowed. So if you're going to vote in the negative team today, you're going to vote off the 4 short reforms that you're seeing right now, and you're going to vote off the change in the Cuban government, increases in privatization, undermine Cuban control of the economy, and that weakens the regime's power. So, going to my opponent's case, on the first idea of investment, we give you one response that goes unresponded to about dual currency. Realize that dual currency turns your entire point because we find that dual currency takes 90% of the money, gives it to the government at a point that increases government longevity and decreases the wages of the Cuban people. They don't access their impacts. But secondly, what we show you is that these hurdles are actually causing businesses to leave the country, which means that they're actually going to see less jobs, more unemployment, more harm to the Cuban people. Second, we show you my opponent says that they solve. We tell you that increases in local competition from founded businesses don't increase wages, don't increase food supply, don't help Cuban people. Secondly, on the idea of change, my opponent tells you that there is no permanent change. We show you privatization from the 90s is still continuing and existing today. They tell you it's not unique. Realize that reform right now undermines the ability of the Cuban government to rebound and control the economy. At the point where we take privatization and give it to the Cuban people, that's more power for the Cuban people to enact the policies and to have a top-down bottom-up approach to democracy. For these reasons, we urge a negative ballot.
Private business. Right. Let's make it this way. That was when it peaked. Why does it matter? It's even more than there were today.
In 2016, it's 33% in the economy. So I would just like to say a comparative analysis to prove your point.
My question is, why did it peak in the 1990s? Like, that means the word peak literally means it went away and they brought it back up from 5% to 33%, like you said. Yeah, sure. Well, I was finishing my sentence.
Show you is that the most crucial period to keep the embargo is when Cuba doesn't have a trading partner, because that's where reform happens. In the 1990s, they didn't have partners, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And the embargo's pressure forced them to make those concessions.
My question is, wait, in that analysis, right, you tell me that Venezuela came in and then they reversed your friends, right? Wait, no, can I finish my question? So does that mean that the Castro regime had more power or Venezuela had more power?
I don't know where this is going.
That means that whoever controls that void when there's no trade has the most leverage over the
Let's trade
Cuban
this out
government.
for a second. Let's trade this out for a second. Okay, so at the point where the growth of the private sector undermines communist or socialist control of the public sector and decreases their capacity to control the economy, that decreases their legitimacy, their longevity, and their power.
We're saying the reason that Venezuela had so much influence over Cuba was because they became Cuba's one of their only trading partners when they were in the midst of an economic recession.
So I'm very clear to explain to Rebuttal that trade leverage doesn't exist because we trade with plenty of bad actors. We don't
Yeah,
respond
there's a
to
lot of
it. Here's the
problems.
thing, right? The reason that they rebounded after Venezuela
Wait.
is
Let's
that
talk
Venezuela
about it.
right
Well,
now
then absolutely
That's
it's
not
not
responsive
responsive to our war.
It's like Saudi Arabia and China, right? Saudi Arabia, if anything, holds leverage over us through their oil. And we are at equal levels with China. But specifically with Cuba, the Stanford evidence indicates that we would be one of their largest trading partners, not the other way
So now
around.
let's look at like Saudi Arabia, right? You tell me that Saudi Arabia definitively has leverage over the United States.
We're not even
Where do we
gonna
see
have
Saudi Arabia influencing the United States political
That's
climate?
not even my argument here. I'm saying it's a two-way street. We provide trade, they provide oil. But fundamentally, it is not like that
But
with
it doesn't
Cuba.
respond to our warrant though, right? You never respond to the warrant. The warrant is that these businesses come in and they're the ones that are the actors of change. They're the ones that push for these liberal economic
Your
reforms.
response.
Two responses. First, with the businesses, they're leaving in the status quo because reforms not. But second, on trade. They say that there's not enough reforms, but we keep the embargo actually for
Actually, thousands of businesses are planning to enter.
You never responded. They did the wings before you asked them my son.
The problem is that the point where the companies who have actually entered Cuba are leaving, even if the companies that want to invest, it doesn't ensure that
I'm
they're
recalling the
second
concession
problem
from
is
the
that
second
on
cross.
trade,
This
we
is a
haven't
very
done
important concession.
Saudi Arabia make any reforms
And
whatsoever.
recall the concession when you literally said FDI would increase. I don't think this is not entering is going to be an issue. We have like 2 seconds. forms of the status quo and economic crisis that Cuba is going under, but they do not respond to the China response that we specifically give you. China is already giving Cuba $1.6 billion in trade in the status quo and even more in loans, which means China is really investing in Cuba, contrary to their evidence which we post-date. But more importantly, we tell you that makes all their impacts completely non-unique. The government gets bankrolled in either world. The government has no incentive to change in either world. The question is if it's better for China to have economic leverage over Cuba, or if it's better for the United States to have leverage. We see there's two reasons why it's better for us. First is that leverage wars. We tell you specifically, the reason that Venezuela got so much leverage over Cuba, as per their own warrants, is because they filled the void when the Soviet Union left. We could fill that void. We could push Cuba towards more democratic and politically liberal economic systems. That's what we tell you. It's so important that we jump in the void in the status quo. Their form of leverage was the fact that 54 prisoners were released. Our form of leverage was the fact that Cuba is now economically interdependent on the United States. That's absolutely crucial. But even if you don't buy that, recognize that FDI goes to the people more so than a country like China would. Because China is investing in the government, not in the people, with loans. But the United States is investing in the economic future of the Cuban people. When they provide FDI, it incentivizes competition that lowers prices. As for their own wars, when farmers get priced out of the market, yes, that is true. But in the long term, they're looking at the snapshot of the bigger picture, where prices of all goods decrease when you have more foreign direct investment. The one response that we're getting by the end of the round is that 90% of the money will go to the Cuban government. There are three front lines that get dodged here. First of all, that is not unique because China will be paying the government in either world. But second of all, even more importantly, Pickle specifically indicates that the reason that FDI is better than loans to the Chinese is because the FDI leads to long-term capitalism. The forces of market spiral out of control like they did in China, like they did in Vietnam. In the long term, we see more and more capitalist reforms, which is why lifting the embargo is absolutely crucial. But even if that wasn't true, we can see positive externalities too. Because even if the Cuban government is getting the vast majority of the funds from FDI, the Cuban people still get the infrastructure that FDI brings to them at lower prices. The wing is absolutely crucial. The status quo is a cycle where we see no real change because capital will never reform itself out of power. The only way is another actor, whether it be U.S. businesses advocating for capitalism or the Cuban middle class was enriched by the lifting of the embargo. We will advocating for breaking that cycle and voting for the affirmation.
Among the people sitting. There's no way, it's just that shit.
Let's get started. Starting off on framework, both teams agree that reforms are what's going to work. They feel that 10% of the incoming money going to is good, 100% is bad. But here's what's really problematic, because the Hogan analysis tells you that right now in the status quo, businesses coming in are still leaving because they want more reform. But here's their only two links to reform, both of which are problematic. First, they tell you that people being more wealthy pushes for more reform, ignoring the fact that 90% of employees are only that's entrenches the regime. Second, they tell you trade leverage is really good, even though we trade with Saudi Arabia, but we haven't gotten them to make a single concession, nor have they ever gotten us to make a single concession before. Insofar as that's true, they will prove to you how trade leverage is actually here. But here's why you're going to be negating, because we have empirically proven that leverage happens. Here are two warrants. One. First, the idea that the GDP is going down and they're in a recession right now, right? World Kings tells you that China isn't interested, but more importantly, Lopez tells you that there is literally no one right now who is going to bankroll Cuba. Don't let my opponents tell you what is going on with the geopolitical deals. Let actual experts tell you. The evidence is very clear. They have no one left to fund them. That's why the GDP is shrinking. Right? And here's the thing, it has worked in the past. Every time their funding pulls out and the U.S. embargo puts pressure on Cuba, we've gone to concessions like in 1990. But this time's unique because there's no one left. Neither China, Venezuela, or Russia will fund them, and they can't prove to you anyone else will. That's our leverage. But second, the idea of elites, which they clean drop. Because when the elites feel their bottom line getting hurt, the elites start pushing for more change from the government. That's why empirically we've seen reform work. Like the New York Times, which tells you we're allowing for more dissent in the country, and Hope, which tells you that the private sector has actually grown. Here's the thing, right? We have reform, but we don't have enough. We need more. The only way to force it is leverage and purity. But here's why affirming short circuits all of that. With dual currency. Because they never adequately respond to this. 90% of the incoming FDI ends up going to the government. That means they're no longer in a recession. That we don't longer have this leverage over them because the government has the money it needs now, right? When Venezuela funded them, the government had money. If we remove the embargo now, the government would have money again too. At the end of the day, you weigh out how to go. In the net world with the embargo, we've seen them make concessions. In the app world, who knows? And for that reason, count on my order.